I reached down into the freezing water of the Zigzag River, and the first thing my hand touched wasn't gravel. It was wet hair, thick and coarse, almost like rope. I jerked my hand back on instinct. 3 seconds later, Owen screamed behind me. Not a warning shout, but the sound of a 30-year-old man seeing something powerful enough to break everything he had ever believed was possible. It was the afternoon of September 19, 1987. We were looking for 2 missing brothers who had gone deer hunting. We weren't looking for this. The body lay partly on its side at the edge of the river. Based on its length, I estimated the Bigfoot would have stood close to 7 feet 2 inches tall. Gray-brown hair covered the body, with dried blood matted along one side of the head. I dropped to my knees, my hands shaking, and checked for a pulse. Then Bill, who had tracked wildlife in the Cascades for nearly 30 years, put one hand on my shoulder without saying a word. He pointed across the river toward the tree line. 2 pairs of eyes were watching us. They didn't belong to ordinary wildlife. 2 adult Sasquatch stood upright among the trees, both taller than any man I had ever met, and one of them was so massive, so physically imposing, that just looking at him made my chest tighten. Welcome back to Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories, the place where we uncover the records that the world has chosen to forget. The story you are about to hear is a work of creative fiction, inspired by the rich folklore and chilling legends of the wilderness. Before we join the rescue team as they face tonight's life-or-death decision, if you have ever felt the presence of mysterious creatures lurking in the deep woods, please hit like and subscribe to support our journey. On the afternoon of September 19, 1987, the ranger station at the entrance to the Mount Hood Forest was moving through the familiar rhythm of a late summer workday. Topographic maps covered the dispatch room wall, held in place by colored pins. Radios sat beneath their charging rack, while the smell of old coffee mixed with damp rain jackets and pine drifting in through the open back door. Grace Holloway stood over the map table when Chief Ranger Rick Devane came in carrying notes from a missing person call. Curtis Anders and his younger brother Dale had left their hunting camp the previous morning to track deer south of the Zigzag River. They were supposed to return before dark to meet Curtis's wife. By that morning, neither man had come back. Their pickup truck was still at the parking area. Food and sleeping bags remained in the bed, and the 2 registered hunting rifles they had taken with them were gone. There was no sign of a fight, no note, and nobody at the nearby camps had seen them return to the main road. One of the last coordinates came from Curtis over the radio around noon the previous day, when he reported that they had crossed a tributary of the Zigzag and were following fresh signs southwest. The second coordinate was logged nearly 2 hours later. The signal was weaker, and the transmission broke up badly enough that dispatch heard only fragments about a slope, water, and back before dark. Grace studied the distance between the 2 points, then ran a ruler across the contour lines. The terrain south of that stretch of river was steep, heavily wooded, and broken by narrow ravines. If Curtis and Dale had followed a wounded deer, drifting only a few hundred yards off the main ridge could have been enough to lose their route back. Grace divided the search area into 3 sectors, giving priority to waterways and natural routes leading toward the river. Owen Petrakis would stay in the middle of the team, managing the radio and marking positions. Bill Sorensen would take the lead and read sign. Grace would carry the map and medical gear and decide when terrain forced them to change course. Bill planted both hands on the edge of the table. When Grace finished marking the final sector, he pointed to the southwest corner and asked Devane whether he had noticed how little hunting or hiking activity had been reported from that area over the previous 2 seasons. It wasn't because there were no deer, and the land wasn't closed. People simply didn't go that deep very often. Devane pointed to the contour lines packed tightly together. Those slopes were full of fallen timber, slick rock, and old-growth forest where abandoned logging routes had almost disappeared. There were no confirmed bear attacks there and no unusual history of accidents. The place was simply difficult to enter and even harder to leave. To Bill, the absence of people was sometimes information of its own. They left the station in the middle of the afternoon. Each carried a radio, first aid gear, a short length of rope, a flashlight, a rain shell, water, emergency food, and a handgun for bear protection, standard practice in that part of the forest. Owen was still fairly new to the job, not experienced enough to hide his uneasiness the way Bill could. After nearly an hour, when the old trail had become little more than moss-covered ground, Owen asked whether the area had ever had a confirmed bear attack. Bill didn't turn around. He shrugged, pushed a fir branch out of the way with his walking stick, and said, "There are places in these woods where I've never felt the need to ask why nobody goes in." Owen gave a short laugh but couldn't tell whether Bill was joking. Grace kept reading coordinates, checking the time, and maintaining a pace fast enough to reach the tributary before the light changed. Bill found 2 boot prints in an old patch of mud, but the edges had softened too much to tell whether they belonged to Curtis or Dale. Nearby, a huckleberry branch had been broken, and a short piece of orange nylon cord was caught near the base of a tree, the kind hunters often used to tie down gear. There was no blood, no spent brass, and no sign that anyone had fallen. Everything still fit inside the boundaries of an ordinary missing person search. Difficult, yes, but structured. Every detail could be logged, and every move had a reason behind it. Close to 5 in the afternoon, the sunlight was already dropping behind the large firs. The 3 of them reached a bend where the tributary widened and slowed into a dark pool before squeezing through a band of rocks downstream. Bill was about 20 feet ahead when he suddenly raised one hand. Grace and Owen stopped immediately. Bill tilted his head, narrowed his eyes, took another breath through his nose, then looked toward the water. The smell Grace picked up reminded her of wet animal hair left too long in an enclosed space, but underneath it was a faint, sweet, sharp odor that anyone who had worked around recovered bodies understood. Bill pointed toward a large shape caught between the gravel bank and the dark edge of the water. From a distance, all 3 thought they were looking at a drowned elk or black bear. Most of the body lay on its side beneath wet leaves, small branches, and moss, with nearly half of it in the water. Bill moved left to get a better angle while Grace approached, using the same scene assessment routine she had relied on for years. She warned Owen not to step onto the soft mud, then used the end of her walking stick to move several branches off the back. Gray-brown hair appeared beneath them, thick and longer around the shoulders than black bear hair. Grace stopped. The texture didn't match either animal. She knelt beside the rocks, pulled on gloves, and reached into the cold water. Her fingers touched the section lying closest to shore. The outer hair was coarse and stiff at the ends, but underneath was a dense layer that held water in heavy clumps. Beneath the hair was thick muscle, but the shoulder didn't have the structure of a bear. Grace moved her hand several inches farther and felt a ridge of bone shaped almost like a human shoulder blade, only much larger. She pulled her hand away. Owen moved closer. Grace was about to tell him to stay back, but he had already crouched and pulled away a mat of moss and wet branches from the upper body. Owen stumbled backward immediately. The sound that came out of his mouth wasn't a word. His heel struck a rock, nearly sending him down before he caught himself on the gravel. An arm covered in wet gray-brown hair stretched along the shoreline, the elbow slightly down, the hand resting palm down in the water. 5 thick fingers were visible beneath the mud, each ending in a dark, short nail. The torso followed proportions close enough to human anatomy to be unmistakable, but the distance from shoulder to hip was far beyond any man Grace had ever helped recover. The head lay turned to one side. The brow was heavy, the jaw wide, and the hair around the neck clung together in wet strands. Near the temple was a major wound where blood had dried into a dark patch beside the ear and extended backward toward the scalp. Nobody tried to call the body a bear after that. Grace watched the chest. There was no movement. She forced herself back into training. Whoever lay in front of her, the first responsibility was still to check for signs of life. She searched beneath the heavy hair at the neck, then tried another location, because the anatomy wasn't quite human. No pulse. Grace checked the eye response from the angle she could reach, then placed 2 fingers over another possible arterial point. Still nothing. Her hand was still shaking when she took out her field notebook. 5:17 in the afternoon. Grace recorded the discovery time, approximate location, position of the body, how much of it was submerged, and the visible head wound. When she reached the line marked species or identification, her pen stopped. She left it blank. In 10 years of search and rescue work, Grace had never left a field empty, simply because she had no word that fit. Finally, Owen asked, his voice still unsteady, "Do we need to call somebody else?" Nobody answered right away. You called the county sheriff for a human body. You called Fish and Wildlife for wildlife. You called the Forest Service when an incident occurred on forest land. But the body in front of them looked far too human to treat like an animal, and far too different from a human being to fit neatly into an ordinary death investigation. Grace told Owen to try Devane first. Part of a voice came through the radio, then vanished beneath static. The river gorge was blocking the signal. Bill said they could climb farther up the slope and try from higher ground, but none of them wanted to leave until they knew whether Curtis and Dale were connected to what they had found. Grace studied the gravel around the body. No backpack, no rifle, no clothing or gear belonging to either brother. The wound on the Bigfoot's head could have come from striking rock, a bullet, blunt force trauma, or something that happened before the body entered the water. They didn't have enough to conclude anything. Bill spoke quietly, separating each word. "Don't look up right away. But somebody's watching us." Grace remained in place for 2 seconds, then slowly raised her head as though she were simply checking the terrain. Across the tributary, about 130 feet away, old-growth forest began immediately behind a strip of wet stones. 2 upright figures stood between the trunks. Their hair blended so well into the darkness beneath the canopy that Grace might have looked straight through them if Bill hadn't pointed them out. Both were Sasquatch. They were close enough for Grace to see the line of their shoulders, the extraordinary length of their arms, and the faint reflection in their eyes as the final daylight faded. The one on the left was smaller, possibly female. She was still taller than anyone on Grace's team, but narrower through the shoulders than the Sasquatch beside her. The hair around her head and neck was gray-brown, with darker hair across the chest, where moisture had soaked it. She stood almost completely still, shoulders lowered, her head slightly bowed toward the dead Bigfoot on Grace's side of the river. Grace couldn't explain why she immediately recognized grief in that posture. She had never been trained to read emotion on a Sasquatch face. But the way the female stood looked too much like families Grace had seen outside emergency rooms while they waited for bad news. The body was still upright, but the weight seemed to have fallen forward through the shoulders. The larger Sasquatch was different. He stood well over 8 feet tall, broad across the shoulders, heavy muscle visible beneath thick dark brown-black hair. One hand closed around a branch beside him, then released it. A few seconds later, his fingers tightened around the wood again. He stepped forward half a pace, stopped at the edge of the darker trees, then eased back slightly. He didn't roar, he didn't bare his teeth, he didn't rush the river. The fact that he didn't do those things made Grace more cautious, not less. Every movement looked like anger, grief, and protective instinct being held back by conscious effort. "Don't run, don't draw, back up slow." Grace nodded. Her handgun remained in its holster, but even thinking about touching it suddenly felt wrong. Owen stood rigid, his hands shaking enough that the radio tapped against the zipper of his jacket. Bill told him to put the radio away and keep both hands visible. The three of them backed away one step at a time toward the body, never fully turning their backs on the two Sasquatch, but also avoiding a hard stare that might look like a challenge. Owen whispered, "Are they gonna attack?" Bill didn't answer immediately. He watched the larger male, especially the distance between him and the river. The water wasn't wide there. If the Sasquatch possessed strength proportional to his size, crossing it would take only a few seconds. Yet he remained on the opposite bank. If he wanted to come across, Bill said quietly, we wouldn't have time to ask that question. They weren't being attacked, they were being watched. Grace noticed something else when the male gripped the branch again. He rarely kept his eyes on Grace, Bill, or Owen for more than a second or two. His attention always returned to the dead Bigfoot. When Grace shifted left, he looked at her hand and then back at the body. When Bill stepped away, the male checked the distance between Bill and the dead Sasquatch. The two across the river didn't appear to be deciding whether to remove three humans from the scene. They were watching to see what those humans intended to do with the dead. Grace stopped farther from the Bigfoot's head, closed her notebook, and held both hands in front of her. Bill did the same. Owen hesitated, then copied them. Nobody touched the body again. The female kept her head lowered. The larger male released the branch, letting his hand hang beside his thigh, though nothing about his posture was relaxed. Grace checked her watch. Daylight was disappearing fast from the bottom of the gorge. They still needed to find a communications point, report the scene, determine what had happened to Curtis and Dale, and decide whether moving after dark was even possible. The route back to the ranger station took more than 2 hours in good conditions. Most of the first section crossed steep ground where one missed step could cause a serious injury. If they left now, darkness would still catch them in the woods. Bill said there was a higher shelf of ground about 260 feet away, where they could put up an emergency shelter and try for radio contact. Grace looked at the two Sasquatch. Neither moved. Less than an hour earlier, the idea would have sounded impossible, but Grace now understood that every decision they made had to account for more than terrain, 2 missing hunters, rescue procedure, and bears. They also had to consider 2 adult Sasquatch guarding a dead family member. Grace decided they would mark the coordinates, collect no samples, leave the body exactly where it was, and move back to the higher ground to attempt contact. If they reached Devane, they would ask for assistance carefully. She didn't want a large armed response moving into the gorge before anyone understood what was happening. The 3 began backing away. Grace went last. The female remained still. The large male stepped partly out of the shadows as the humans increased their distance, then stopped at the rocks on the opposite bank. He didn't follow. Only 4 eyes held the space between the 2 sides of the river. By the time Grace, Bill, and Owen reached the higher ground, the remaining light had turned blue-gray. Owen tried the radio and caught only a fragment from the ranger station, too weak to transmit a full report. Bill began choosing where to rig the emergency tarp. Grace stood facing the river through the trees. The 2 figures were still there. She checked her watch and did the simple calculation again. Even if they left immediately, they couldn't reach the ranger station before complete darkness. No member of her team was going down a steep, wet slope at night, simply because staying close to an unexplained scene felt frightening. The shelf of ground beneath their boots was less than 300 feet from the dead Bigfoot. Grace looked through the trees one final time. Across the zigzag, 4 eyes were still watching, and she understood that the search and rescue team would be sleeping right there that night. Around 6 that evening, the last light along the zigzag river had shifted from gold to cold gray. Grace Holloway stood on the shelf of ground less than 300 feet from the body, looking through a gap in the trees toward the bend below. The 2 Sasquatch were still on the opposite bank and hadn't changed position. The smaller one stood with lowered shoulders, her head angled toward the dead Bigfoot. The larger male shifted his weight from one leg to the other now and then, but he didn't come down to the water. Grace knew they couldn't make it back to the ranger station before dark, and leaving now would also mean abandoning an unidentified body, while 2 missing hunters were still unaccounted for. There was nothing in a search and rescue manual for this. Grace had to build a temporary protocol on the spot. She chose a patch of level ground behind 2 fallen fir trunks, high enough to stay clear of rising water and far enough from the body that they wouldn't look as though they were claiming the scene. Bill Sorensen checked the area, ruled out a rotten stump with an old beehive inside, then identified 3 possible escape routes in case of a bear or a falling tree. Owen Petrakis spread the emergency tarp low to the ground, his hands still shaking slightly, as he tried to tie the line around 2 low branches. Grace said they would keep their distance, leave the body untouched for the rest of the night, collect no samples, use no flash photography, and make no attempt to cross the river. Bill added 3 rules from years of working around large wildlife. Don't stare at the Sasquatch for too long, don't make sudden movements, and don't raise your voice. He said they had no idea how much the 2 Bigfoot understood about human body language, but every large animal he had ever worked around reacted to how people occupied space. The less pressure they created, the better their chances of getting through the night without forcing a response. Owen tried the radio again. He extended the antenna all the way, climbed onto a stump, turned toward the ranger station, and called 3 times. Static answered. A few moments later, a broken fragment of sound slipped through, too weak to make out any words. Owen switched to the backup channel, tried again, then shook his head. The mountain walls on both sides of the gorge were blocking everything. Grace decided they would try once every hour and again at first light, but until they got a signal, they were on their own. Bill gathered small dry branches and scraped out a shallow fire pit behind the fallen trunk. He didn't want a large fire. A high flame might make the Sasquatch think the humans were trying to drive them back or claim territory. He built only enough fire to heat water and warm their hands. Thin smoke moved low beneath the canopy. Grace divided the food into 3 portions, tied up anything with a strong smell, and hung it away from where they would sleep in case of bears. Nobody felt hungry, but she made Owen eat half an emergency bar and drink some water. Once full darkness settled in, the opposite bank became a solid wall of black. The 2 figures disappeared from clear view. Only now and then, when moonlight broke through the clouds and reflected off the river, Grace caught the line of a massive shoulder between the trees before it vanished again. Not being able to see them didn't lessen the feeling of being watched, it made it worse. Every falling leaf and every small branch snapping somewhere in the dark made Owen turn his head. Grace divided the watch. Bill took the first shift from 9 until close to midnight. Grace would take the middle watch, and Owen would cover the final hours before dawn. Whoever was awake would sit near the edge of the shelf, keep the flashlight off, unless absolutely necessary, leave the handgun in its holster, and keep the radio within reach. The other 2 would stay under the tarp, fully dressed, boots still on. Nobody said it aloud, but all 3 understood that if something moved up from the river, they wouldn't have much time to discuss what to do. Around 10:30, Bill heard water move lightly below. He didn't wake the others right away. The sound resembled one large foot stepping into shallow water and stopping. About a minute later, a small branch snapped across the river. Bill looked down through the trees but couldn't see anything. He could only hear low, steady breathing from somewhere at a distance. When Grace came to take over the watch, Bill told her quietly what he had heard. Nothing suggested either Sasquatch had approached the camp. There had been no threat call either. Close to midnight, the clouds opened enough for moonlight to fall across the river. Grace had just picked out the smaller Sasquatch standing near the bank when a low sound began from the other side. It started so deep that she felt the vibration in her chest before she clearly heard it. The note held steady for a long time, then dropped lower, almost like a cry that had been held in the throat too long. It wasn't a roar. There was no aggressive rhythm to it. It sounded closer to mourning than any animal call Grace had ever heard. Bill sat upright immediately. Owen opened his eyes, too. Nobody had to ask where the sound had come from. A second call followed, shorter but deeper. Then the forest went quiet again. Bill stared toward the river for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said that in nearly 30 years working in those mountains, he had never heard anything like it. Not because of how loud it was, but because of the emotion carried inside it. He didn't claim to understand what he had heard. He only said that if it meant what he thought it did, then there wasn't a pack of animals waiting down there to attack them. There might be a family staying beside someone who had died. Nobody slept deeply after that. Grace listened to the wind change direction, to water moving over stone, to Owen shifting beside her under the tarp. Sometime after 2 in the morning, she caught 2 points of reflected light low on the opposite bank. Then they disappeared. The Sasquatch didn't come closer. No footsteps moved around the camp. But their presence seemed to put weight over the entire valley, keeping all 3 humans quiet and careful with every movement. Near dawn, Owen took the final watch. The sky was still dark, but a narrow strip of gray had begun forming in the east. He sat with his knees pulled up, trying not to look at his watch too often. When there was finally enough light to separate the waterline from the rocks, Owen looked down toward the scene and suddenly stood. He stared for several seconds, then turned and shook Grace hard by the shoulder. "Wake up." Something changed. Grace opened her eyes immediately. Bill was already sitting up before Owen called a second time. All 3 crawled out from under the tarp and stood behind the fallen trunk. Beside the dead Bigfoot, where the night before there had been only rocks and wet branches, a bright patch of orange now lay near the shoulder. None of them had gone down there during the night. None of them had heard footsteps or any major movement in the water. Grace raised her binoculars, adjusted the focus, and saw a hunting jacket with one sleeve torn open. They waited almost 10 minutes before deciding to go down. The 2 Sasquatch were still across the river, easier to see in the growing daylight. The female stood behind a large tree. The male was closer to the water than he had been the night before, but he showed no threatening movement. Grace went first. Bill followed 2 steps behind, and Owen stayed at the rear. All 3 kept their hands well away from their guns. The jacket had been placed beside the body, the back folded almost flat, rather than tangled the way something swept in by current would have been. The safety orange fabric was muddy, with a tear running along the left sleeve. Several dried brown-red streaks marked the shoulder and wrist. Grace knelt, but didn't touch it immediately. She studied the stones and mud around it for footprints or drag marks. There were no fresh boot prints. A few patches of damp sand near the water had been compressed, but none held a clear shape. Grace recognized the jacket's style. Bright orange outerwear was required for legal deer hunters during hunting season to reduce the risk of accidental shootings. Curtis and Dale had been reported wearing that kind of gear when they left camp. Grace pulled on gloves, opened the jacket carefully, and checked an inside pocket. A small nylon wallet sat beneath the fabric. Inside were a hunting license, a little cash, a scrap of paper with a phone number, and an Oregon identification card. The name on the card was Curtis Anders. Owen let out a short breath and took 1 step back. Bill looked across the river. The male Sasquatch was staring directly at the jacket. Grace held the identification card for several seconds, then returned it to the exact place she had found it. She didn't want to disturb the arrangement any more than necessary before they could document it properly. Bill crouched near the lower half of the dead Bigfoot and studied the distance between the jacket and the body. He said there was no way the jacket had simply floated in and settled like that. The upper fabric was dry, even though the surrounding stones were wet with morning moisture. Mud clung to the lower edge, but there were no leaves or branches caught in it the way there would have been if the jacket had been dragged through the river. Somebody had carried it there and put it down during the night. Owen asked the question all three of them were thinking. If Curtis's jacket was here, and there was blood on it, where was Curtis? Alive somewhere? Injured? Dead deeper in the forest? Grace didn't answer. She leaned closer to examine the dried stains. The fatal wound on the Bigfoot was on the right side of the head, with dried blood concentrated around the temple and neck. Curtis's jacket had the heaviest blood staining along the left sleeve and near the wrist. The placement didn't fit with the jacket simply brushing against the wound on the dead Bigfoot. Bill saw it too. He pointed with the end of his pen without touching the fabric. The blood might belong to Curtis or somebody else. It could still belong to the dead Sasquatch from another moment in the encounter, but the pattern didn't let them say. Whatever the source, the jacket created the first direct connection between the disappearance of Curtis and Dale Anders and the death beside the river. Grace looked toward the two Sasquatch. The part that bothered her most wasn't simply that Curtis's jacket had appeared. It was the way it had been placed. The night before, the humans had stopped touching the body. They had backed away, stayed quiet, and given the grieving Sasquatch space. By morning, an item belonging to Curtis had appeared beside the dead Bigfoot, in a position no human could miss. Grace didn't know whether she was ready to call that communication, but it looked far more deliberate than chance. She told Bill quietly that maybe they were being shown something. Bill didn't argue. He only said that if they were, the important thing was not to pretend they understood more than they did. A jacket proved Curtis had been connected to the scene somehow. It didn't tell them what he had done, who had been injured first, or where Dale was. Owen tried the radio again. The signal was still too weak to hold. Grace decided they would document the jacket, the discovery time, and its position, then look for higher ground after checking the shoreline. Bill walked about 60 feet along the water, eyes fixed on the ground. He stopped at a patch of dark mud behind a stand of ferns, crouched, then called Grace over. A broad drag mark ran through the wet soil, almost as wide as a man's shoulders, leading away from the river and into the trees. Leaves had been pressed flat along both edges, and the earth had been scraped into uneven lines. In several places there were faint heel marks. The trail didn't run toward the two Sasquatch across the river. It angled southeast into a steep section of forest the team hadn't searched the day before. Bill followed it several yards, then returned. He said the mark didn't look like an injured animal dragging itself. Whatever weight had been moved along that route was heavy at times, and partly lifted at others, because the trail disappeared and returned. If Curtis or Dale had been injured at the river, somebody had moved one of them away from the scene. The argument was short but tense. Owen wanted all three to go. Grace didn't want to leave the body, the jacket, and the observation point unattended. Bill agreed with her. If the two Sasquatch were judging how the humans handled the scene, having all three disappear at once might change the situation. Grace finally decided Owen would remain on the higher shelf, keep the radio, watch the river, and use his whistle if anything moved toward the camp. 2 short blasts meant come back immediately. 1 long blast meant direct danger. Owen didn't like it, but he nodded. Grace checked that her handgun was still secured in its holster, adjusted the first aid strap on her shoulder, and checked her water. Bill marked their initial direction, and the two of them started following the drag trail. The trail stayed fairly clear across soft ground for the first couple hundred yards. Leaves were scraped aside, and low branches had broken in the direction of travel. Then the ground turned rocky, and the trail disappeared. Bill didn't stop. He looked for mud smeared across stone, scraped moss, and branches bent the wrong way. Each sign meant almost nothing by itself, but Bill connected them into a continuous line. Grace stayed close behind, tying small strips of cloth at several points so they could find the route back quickly. About half a mile into the forest, Bill raised one hand. A hunting rifle lay beneath a cedar. Grace recognized the model as the type Devane had listed for Curtis. The stock was badly scratched. The sling had snapped. What stopped both of them was the barrel. Near the muzzle, the steel had been bent sharply to one side. It didn't look like damage from dropping the rifle on rock. Bill lifted it with a cloth, examined it briefly, then put it back down. Bending that section of steel would have required a kind of force that an ordinary fall was unlikely to produce. They kept going. The metallic smell of blood reached them before they saw the next scene. A wide patch of ground between 3 trees had been torn apart. Ferns were crushed flat. 2 large branches had snapped higher than Grace's head. Deep grooves crossed the soil as though somebody had been dragged or thrown. Dried blood-marked leaves, rocks, and the base of one tree. Bill knelt beside the largest stain, touched the edge lightly with a glove, and studied how dry it had become. He said it had been there at least 12 hours, maybe longer. That fit the period before their team had discovered the dead Bigfoot. Grace looked around. Human boot prints were present, but most had been overlapped by much larger depressions that were difficult to read in the disturbed ground. There was no sign of Dale, no backpack. No spent cartridge immediately around them, though a fresh patch of bark had been blown from a tree at about Grace's chest height. Bill pointed ahead. The blood trail became lighter and led toward a shallow rock hollow almost completely hidden by thick brush. Grace could feel her pulse beating hard in her neck, but she forced herself to move slowly and check every dark space around them. They were less than 30 feet from the opening when Bill raised his hand to stop her. A faint sound came from inside, a low moan. Not wildlife, not wind, human. Grace stopped to think. She ran forward. Grace rushed to the rock hollow and dropped to her knees before her eyes had fully adjusted to the darkness. The air beneath the low stone overhang was thick with the smell of damp earth, dried blood, and human sweat. A man lay curled against the wall, his sweater torn at the shoulder, hunting pants caked with mud, one leg stretched out at an angle no leg should take. It took Grace only a few seconds to recognize the face from the photograph Devane had shown them before they left. Curtis Anders was alive. She called his name twice. Curtis's eyelids fluttered, then opened. His pupils still reacted to the flashlight, but his lips were cracked and dry, and his breathing came in short pulls. Bill moved in behind her, knelt beside the injured leg, and motioned for Grace to keep Curtis still. The lower left leg showed an obvious fracture. The fabric around the shin was stretched tight from swelling, but no bone had broken through the skin. Both arms were covered in scratches. His neck was bruised, and one side of his face had swollen dark. Bill checked his pulse, skin temperature, and response in the foot, then said quietly that Curtis was badly dehydrated and in shock, but with the leg properly stabilized, they could move him. Grace took out a water bottle, moistened Curtis's lips first, then let him drink in small sips. She spoke slowly and evenly, reminded him of her name, told him he was with search and rescue, and that they had found him. Curtis looked at her as if it took several seconds for the words to reach him. When Grace asked where Dale was, his jaw tightened. He turned his face toward the rock wall and closed his eyes. Grace didn't push. She kept checking his hands and asked whether he had chest pain, trouble breathing, or numbness in the injured leg. Each simple question seemed to pull him a little farther back into the present. Bill cut 2 straight lengths from dead branches, padded them with cloth, and splinted the broken leg with triangular bandages. Curtis clenched his teeth but didn't cry out. When Bill tightened the final knot, Grace gave him more water and asked what had happened after he and Dale left camp. Curtis took nearly a full minute before he started. His voice was rough and broken. He said they had been tracking a buck since morning, staying mostly along the north slope at first. The tracks were fresh, and there was only a little blood on the leaves, so Dale believed the deer had already been wounded and wouldn't go far. They crossed one small creek, then another rocky slope. Curtis said that by the time he realized they had gone too deep, the radio was only picking up scraps of signal. Dale still wanted to keep going, because the deer sign remained clear. They dropped into a small basin full of fallen timber and saw the first things that didn't make sense. Branches broken higher than a man could comfortably reach, a bundle of dry grass placed beneath a fir, then several enormous footprints pressed into the mud. Curtis thought they were bear tracks distorted by water. Dale said nothing. Late that afternoon, they heard movement ahead. Not running. A short, low vocalization, deep enough that Curtis felt it in his chest. Both brothers stopped. A female Bigfoot stepped between two trees less than 100 feet away. She stood over 6.5 feet tall, covered in gray-brown hair, thick through the chest and shoulders. Behind her, Curtis could see a shallow depression between the roots of a large tree, packed with dry leaves, and at least one smaller shape moving inside. That was when he understood they had walked directly into the living area of a Sasquatch family. Curtis said he raised one hand and told Dale to back away slowly. The female didn't charge. She simply stood between them and the nesting area behind her, body slightly turned, arms hanging low. Curtis had hunted since childhood. He knew the difference between the posture of an animal protecting young and the posture of one preparing to hunt. Dale didn't see it that way. All he saw was a body far too large to belong to anything he understood, standing upright close enough for him to make out the face. Dale raised his rifle. Curtis said he grabbed the barrel and yelled at him not to shoot. Dale pulled it away. The female Sasquatch gave a short call and took one step forward. The first shot went off almost at the same moment. The bullet struck somewhere around the shoulder or neck. Curtis wasn't sure. The female twisted hard, but stayed on her feet. Dale fired a second time, then a third. Curtis heard himself shouting, heard brass dropping into the leaves, heard a low sound tear out of the female. After the final shot, she dropped to one knee, caught herself with one hand, then fell sideways into the ferns. Curtis stopped talking. Both hands had begun to shake. Grace rested one hand on his forearm and said nothing. Bill looked toward the mouth of the hollow, his jaw locked tight. Curtis swallowed with difficulty, then went on. He said the woods remained completely still for only a few seconds. Then a roar came from the slope to their left, so deep and powerful that Curtis felt it through his chest. Branches moved overhead. A massive male Sasquatch came down the slope at a run. Curtis remembered only pieces: dark brown-black hair, enormous shoulders, one hand swatting his rifle away, as though it were nothing more than a branch. Dale turned to run but slipped on the wet ground. The male didn't go after Curtis. He passed him and went straight after Dale. Curtis heard Dale scream, then wood breaking, a heavy impact, and one more gunshot somewhere behind him. Curtis tried to get up and follow, but something struck or shoved him from the side and sent him down the slope. His left leg caught between two rocks and broke when the rest of his body twisted. Grace asked whether Curtis had actually seen anyone hit him. He shook his head. It might have been a large branch knocked loose. The male Sasquatch might have clipped him while charging past. He didn't know. When Curtis managed to crawl away from the rocks, he saw the female Bigfoot lying motionless. Dale was gone. All Curtis could hear was low growling moving deeper into the forest, with an occasional short human sound mixed in, then nothing. Tears ran from the corners of Curtis's eyes and cut through the dirt along his temples. He kept shaking his head, as if stopping would make the memories sharpen again. Grace asked one final time whether he knew if Dale was alive. Curtis whispered that he didn't. He remembered crawling, dragging the broken leg through the dirt, finding the rock hollow and pulling himself inside before dark. Through the night, he heard several low calls somewhere in the distance. Eventually, even those stopped. He had no idea where Dale was. Grace and Bill stepped several feet outside the hollow to talk. Curtis needed water, a better splint, and evacuation as soon as possible. But Dale was still a missing person. If the human sounds Curtis heard after the chase had come from Dale, then he might be badly injured somewhere in the forest, and not necessarily dead. Grace couldn't ignore that possibility, just because the story they had heard made the situation more difficult. Bill looked southeast, toward the direction Curtis said the growling had moved. He offered to go alone. Grace could take Curtis back toward the rendezvous point with Owen and begin working out an evacuation route or finding better radio ground. Bill could move much faster if he wasn't helping carry an injured man. He had been reading sign for nearly 30 years. He knew how to keep distance and when to turn back if a situation became something he couldn't control. Grace didn't like the plan. The three-person team had already been split once, and now they were about to divide again. If Bill got hurt, they would have 3 separate emergencies inside a region with no reliable communications. But standing beside the rock hollow arguing wasn't helping Dale either. Grace finally agreed on one condition. Bill would not draw his weapon unless his life was in immediate danger. If he encountered the 2 Sasquatch from the river or any others, he would back away, not advance, and not touch anything they were guarding. Bill nodded, checked his compass, water and whistle, then looked back at Curtis once. At that moment, 2 short whistle blasts sounded in the distance. Grace and Bill both turned. The signal was weak but clear, coming from the direction of the river. 2 short blasts meant Owen needed them back immediately. Grace waited a few seconds. There was no third signal. Bill said Owen might have seen the 2 Sasquatch moving, or somebody else could have entered the area. Grace looked at Curtis. Getting him across half a mile of terrain in his condition would take a long time. Curtis understood before she said anything. He grabbed Grace's wrist, his grip weak but determined. He told her to prop him against a tree outside the hollow, leave him water, and go help Owen. He could sit there. If he had to, he would drag himself a little at a time. Grace said no. Curtis shook his head and said Dale had already caused enough trouble by panicking, and he didn't want another person getting hurt because somebody had to stay and watch him. Another whistle sounded. This one was longer and more urgent. Grace made the decision immediately. Bill would continue toward the direction of Dale's trail, but if he found nothing clear, he would turn back within 40 minutes. Grace helped Curtis out of the hollow and positioned him against a large tree in a spot protected from the wind. She left a water bottle, the first aid kit, and a spare whistle within reach. She told him that if he saw any Sasquatch, he was not to pick up a rock, a stick, or make any defensive move unless he was directly attacked. Curtis nodded, his face pale from pain. Bill disappeared southeast into the trees. Grace turned back toward the route they had marked and started running. The strips of cloth tied along the trail kept her from losing time, but the rocky ground was still slick. She jumped over roots, slipped once, caught herself with one hand, and pushed back up. All she could see in her mind was Owen alone on the shelf above the river and the 2 Sasquatch who had watched them all night. When a 4th whistle sounded, Grace ran faster. While Grace and Bill were gone, Owen had done everything he could to follow the rules they had set. He sat on the shelf of ground with the radio beside his thigh, shifting his attention between Curtis's orange jacket, the dead Bigfoot, and the far bank. Morning light continued to build. The 2 Sasquatch were still there, but the distance between them and the water had changed. The male stood lower now, closer to the river. The smaller female followed several steps behind. Owen saw the male enter the water first. There was no roar. He planted one foot on a rock, water rising nearly to his knee, then stepped forward again. Only 3 long strides carried him through the deepest section. Owen stood on instinct. His right hand went to the grip of his handgun. Bill's words from the night before came back immediately. Don't run, don't draw, don't turn fear into a threat signal. Owen pulled his hand away from the gun. He backed up one step, then another, and raised both hands to chest level, with his palms open. The male Sasquatch looked at him, but only briefly. He came out of the water and walked directly toward the dead Bigfoot. The distance between Owen and the male was now less than 60 feet. The smaller female crossed too, moving more slowly. She stopped among the rocks at the shoreline, her eyes fixed on the body. Owen could feel his legs shaking, but he didn't run. He knew that if the male decided to chase him, the distance between them meant almost nothing. All Owen could do was stand still and make it clear that he wasn't going to interfere. The male reached the body. He stood near the head, opening and closing both hands. His chest rose and fell heavily. After several seconds, he lifted his face toward the sky and released a sound that almost buckled Owen's knees. The roar wasn't directed at him. It went upward, deep and sustained, rolling across the water and through the trunks. There was anger inside it, but beneath the anger was a broken quality that sounded unmistakably like pain. Owen felt the vibration in his teeth and breastbone. He had never heard any animal produce a sound that seemed to hold two opposite emotions inside the same breath. When the roar finally stopped, the forest didn't answer right away. Only the river kept moving over stone. The male bent down. Owen clenched both hands to keep them from shaking. The Sasquatch reached out and touched the dead female's shoulder, very slowly, then brushed wet hair away from her face. The movement looked awkward because of the size of his hand, but it was so gentle that Owen suddenly felt ashamed that only minutes earlier he had considered drawing his gun. The male lowered his head until his forehead was almost touching hers. The smaller female came closer. She stopped beside him and placed one hand against his back. Neither made a sound. They stood over the body, one with his head lowered, the other keeping a hand on him, in a posture Owen had seen years earlier at his own grandfather's funeral. Owen no longer thought of them as two animals guarding a carcass. He was watching a family grieve. The distance between them was now about 30 feet. Owen didn't dare move. He didn't know whether he should look or turn away. What was happening in front of him felt too private to witness, but leaving suddenly could be read the wrong way. In the end, he lowered his eyes toward the ground near his boots and looked up only often enough to track their movement. The male touched the wound on the dead female's head. His fingers paused around the dried blood. Then he looked at Curtis's orange jacket and turned toward Owen. That look stopped Owen cold, not because the male was preparing to attack, but because the connection seemed too clear. The jacket, the wound, the humans standing here. Owen reached for the whistle very slowly. He didn't know whether he was calling Grace because he was in danger or because he couldn't make this decision by himself. He blew 2 short blasts. The male looked at him but didn't react aggressively. Owen waited. When Grace still didn't appear, he blew 1 long blast. The female Sasquatch bent closer to the dead body and made a low, brief sound, almost like breath carrying a note. The male answered with something deeper. Then both became still again. Owen stood only a few steps away, the whistle still in his hand, with the uneasy feeling that he had somehow found himself in the middle of a ritual he had no right to name. A branch broke behind him. Owen turned. Grace burst through the trees, breathing hard, one hand catching the trunk of a tree to stop herself. She looked at Owen first, saw that he wasn't hurt, then looked down toward the riverbank. Both Sasquatch were still beside dead female. The smaller one kept a hand against her back. The male slowly raised his head. He turned directly toward Grace. Grace didn't move. The distance between them was too short now for her to pretend this was still observation from far away. But in his eyes she didn't see the rage she had prepared herself to face. He didn't charge. His hands didn't close into fists. He didn't bare his teeth. The male Sasquatch simply looked at her, then at the dead female, then back at Grace. Owen looked toward her for help, but said nothing. At their feet, the zigzag kept running over the rocks with an almost unsettling calm, as if the forest had known the answer long before any of them arrived. Grace understood the feeling before she could put it into words. It wasn't a threat. It was a silent question, waiting for her answer. Bill Sorensen headed away from the river with a heavier step than when he had left. Following Curtis's description, he moved southeast, toward the direction where the low growls and human sounds had faded the previous afternoon. The terrain climbed sharply at first, then dropped into a strip of loose rock, exposed roots, and broken ground. In the softer patches, Bill found a second drag trail, different from the one that had led to Curtis's rock shelter. This one was wider, heavier, and less even. At times it angled left, then swept almost in an arc, as though whoever had been dragged could no longer keep his body straight. In several places, the heels of a pair of boots had cut deep grooves through the soil before disappearing across stone. Bill didn't rush. He marked each point with his eyes, looking for scraps of fabric caught on branches, flattened moss, and fresh mud splashed low against tree trunks. Eventually, the trail led him into an area where the ground had been torn apart, far more violently than anything he and Grace had seen near Curtis's rifle. 2 young trees had been snapped at about chest height. A large patch of bark had been ripped from the base of a fir. Dirt and leaves had been churned into uneven piles, with human boot prints crossing long, broad depressions pressed deep into the ground. A dark patch of dried blood stained a low rock. Bill crouched beside it. He didn't need to touch it to know this hadn't come from an ordinary fall. He moved around a pile of fallen timber and saw Dale Anders lying in a low patch of ground behind it. The body rested partly on one side, one arm trapped beneath the torso, the safety orange hunting jacket muddy and torn from shoulder to ribs. Bill stopped several yards away. Over the course of his search and rescue career, he had seen people killed by falls, crushed beneath trees, lost to exposure, and attacked by wildlife. But Dale's injuries showed a level of force that couldn't be mistaken for an accident. One side of his chest had collapsed inward. An arm was broken. Deep bruising covered the neck and shoulders. There was no sign of life. Bill removed his hat and stood there for a long time. He didn't pray, and he didn't try to force the man in front of him into the role of villain or victim. Dale had fired in panic. A female Bigfoot was dead. Then a massive male had gone after him. That sequence didn't make Dale's death any less tragic, and it didn't turn what happened into an unprovoked slaughter by the Sasquatch, either. Bill understood that whatever they eventually put into a report could pull the truth toward one side or the other, depending on the words they chose. He recorded the coordinates, the position of the body, the disturbed ground, and every visible sign around it. Near Dale's right hand lay a wristwatch that had come loose. The leather strap was torn, the crystal shattered, and one of the hands was jammed in place. Bill picked it up with a cloth. The hour and minute hands had stopped at about 6:43. He had no way of knowing whether that marked the moment of the confrontation or simply the instant the watch struck a rock, but he placed it in a separate evidence pouch. At the very least, Dale's family would get back something that had been with him during his final hours. Bill moved more slowly on the way back. He thought about the questions Devane would ask. The county sheriff would have questions too. Maybe Fish and Wildlife, maybe others. If Bill wrote only animal attack, that wouldn't be the whole truth. If he wrote everything exactly as he had seen and heard it, teams could come into the forest with rifles, cameras, helicopters, and orders before anyone understood what had really happened. Bill had no intention of hiding Dale's death. He simply wanted the event described for what it had been: an accidental encounter, a gunshot fired in fear, and then a violent response from a family that had just lost one of its own. As he approached the river, Bill heard the water before he saw daylight breaking through the trees. He stopped behind a large cedar and looked out from a distance. Grace and Owen were still on the near bank. The 2 Sasquatch remained beside the dead female, the male with his head lowered, the smaller female standing slightly behind him with one hand close to his shoulder. Nobody was charging, nobody was running. For one brief second, Bill let himself breathe easier, because the scene had not collapsed into violence while he was gone. Then he stepped out of the trees. Grace turned toward him. One look at Bill's face told her most of what she needed to know. Bill removed his gloves, held the small evidence pouch containing the broken watch, and spoke in a rough voice shaped by exhaustion and what he had just found. "I found him. And I think we need to talk about what we're gonna put in that report." Grace looked at the evidence pouch, then across at the two Sasquatch. Owen closed his eyes for a moment. Nobody asked whether Dale was alive. The answer was already there in the way Bill stood. Grace said they would deal with the report after Curtis was evacuated and the scene was secure. Right now, they still had one problem they couldn't avoid. The dead female Bigfoot remained at the river, and none of them knew what would happen if they called in a recovery team to take her away. Grace realized they needed some way to approach that could be understood as asking permission instead of claiming ownership. She said as much to Bill. He looked at the male, then at the distance between them and the body. Bill believed people made a mistake when they assumed every form of communication had to use words. Around large wildlife, posture, distance, speed, and eye contact could matter more than sound. But he also reminded Grace that these Sasquatch had already shown behavior that went far beyond simple animal reflex. That made it even more important not to treat the dead female as an object to be processed. Bill removed his pack and set it on the ground. He lowered himself onto one knee, making his body smaller, and kept both hands where the Sasquatch could see them, palms open. Then he moved toward the body in very short, slow increments. Grace stayed behind him, nowhere near her handgun. Owen stepped back and tried to control his breathing. When Bill had closed the distance by about 10 feet, the male Sasquatch raised his head immediately. He stepped forward. The movement carried enormous weight. His shoulders tightened, his arms dropped low, and both hands closed into fists. Bill stopped at once. He didn't back away. He didn't move closer. The space between them locked in place. Grace became aware of how little she could hear besides the river and breathing. Then the smaller female reached up from behind the male and placed one hand on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture. Her hand remained there for several seconds. The male turned his head toward her. His body stayed tense, but he didn't take another step. Grace could see that the gesture wasn't meaningless. The female was restraining him, or at least asking him to wait. Owen leaned toward Grace and whispered that maybe the decision here belonged to somebody else, not to the rescue team. Grace understood what he meant. The female was smaller, but the way the male responded to her showed that influence couldn't be measured by size alone. She might have been a sister, an adult daughter, or some other family member whose place in the group carried weight. They couldn't know. But Grace was looking at a real relationship between them, not two Sasquatch acting independently. Bill remained on one knee. He slowly lowered one hand to the ground, then moved forward another half step. The male watched his hand. Grace suddenly took the first aid bag from her shoulder. She moved forward just enough to bend down and place it on the ground, then stepped back. Inside were bandages, scissors, tools, everything that made her look like someone preparing to intervene. Setting the bag down was the only way Grace could think of to say that they weren't going to take anything by force. The male looked at the bag. Then at Grace. After a long pause, he turned back toward the dead female. He lowered his head until his forehead came close to the wet hair around her face and stayed that way for several seconds. The smaller female remained beside him. Then the male straightened and stepped back. He wasn't leaving. He wasn't surrendering the body. He had simply created a little more space between himself and the dead female. Bill didn't move right away. He waited, then looked toward Grace. Grace waited too. After several more seconds, she lowered her head slightly. She had no idea whether the gesture meant anything to them, but she wanted to show that she understood the space they had been given was conditional. Nobody touched the body. They simply stood there and let the quiet confirm that a boundary had been recognized. Just as the tension began to ease, a different sound reached them through the trees. At first, Grace thought the wind had shifted. Bill looked up first. A low, repeating beat came from somewhere beyond the ridge. distant at first, then steadily louder. Helicopter rotors. The male Sasquatch reacted immediately. His head snapped upward, eyes searching the sky. His body tightened again, shoulders rising, knees slightly bent as though preparing to move. The smaller female turned too. Grace looked at Bill. Nobody on their team had called a helicopter. Their radio had barely worked all night. Owen grabbed the radio and switched to the emergency channel. Static filled the speaker, then a faint voice came through. It wasn't Devane. Grace heard her own name somewhere inside the broken transmission. She took the radio from Owen, raised the antenna, and called back. The second time, Curtis's voice came through more clearly. Curtis had dragged himself away from the place where Grace had left him. Using a branch for support, he had worked his way toward higher ground. The pain from his broken leg had nearly made him pass out more than once. But when Grace didn't return when he expected her to, and he heard the whistle signals in the distance, he thought the team was in trouble. He still had a personal emergency locator in one of his pockets, the kind hunters sometimes carried into remote country. Acting on pure survival instinct, Curtis had activated it. Grace closed her eyes for 1 second. She couldn't blame him, a man with a broken leg, severe dehydration, who had watched his brother disappear into the woods, and then been left alone, while emergency whistles sounded somewhere in the distance, had done exactly what anyone would expect. He had called for help. The problem was that his distress signal was now bringing a rescue helicopter directly toward the place where 2 Sasquatch had just allowed the humans to stand near their dead. The engine grew louder. The heavy beat of the rotor blades pushed through the valley, startling birds from the canopy. The male moved sideways and put himself between the body and the direction of the sound. He reached down and gripped a dead branch lying on the ground. The wood cracked in his hand. Grace had no idea what he would do if the helicopter came in low. He might run, he might throw the branch, he might charge the humans, he might try to carry the dead female away. Any of those possibilities could end with gunfire the moment a rescue crew looked down and saw an 8-foot Sasquatch standing beneath them. Grace called over the emergency frequency and asked the aircraft to identify itself. A male voice answered through static. They were responding to a personal distress beacon in the zigzag area and were only a few minutes out. Grace answered immediately. Do not descend. Do not approach the beacon coordinates. There was dangerous large wildlife at the scene, and an aerial approach could trigger an unpredictable defensive response. She ordered them to divert toward an open area to the west and maintain altitude. The pilot asked her to repeat the instruction. From his perspective, it made little sense. There was an injured person on the ground and a rescue aircraft already inbound. Grace repeated herself, harder this time. Do not make a direct approach. The area is not safe for air access. Divert now. Bill moved slightly forward. When the helicopter briefly appeared through a gap above the treetops, he stepped into a position that partly blocked the male Sasquatch's line of sight toward the sky. Bill knew perfectly well that his body couldn't hide a helicopter. It was instinct. But Grace saw what he was doing. He was trying to do the same thing they had done all night. Reduce pressure. The male looked at Bill, then up toward the helicopter. His hand remained locked around the branch. The smaller female placed a hand against his arm again. This time, the male gave a hard vibration through his chest and released a short, low sound that was nothing like the morning call from the night before. This one was sharp, controlled, and unmistakably defensive. Owen stepped back. Grace stayed on the radio. Finally, the pilot confirmed that he was turning away. The rotor noise remained painfully loud for almost another minute. The downwash hadn't reached the floor of the gorge, but the mechanical beat struck the mountain walls and echoed back and forth. Grace thought the male would lose control. He raised the branch slightly, then lowered it again. The female remained beside him. The dead Bigfoot lay between the Sasquatch and the search and rescue team, untouched by either side. Grace continued directing the helicopter toward a secondary location closer to the old access road. She reported that they had one surviving hunter with a broken leg on higher ground to the east, and that the ground team would bring him toward the extraction point if possible. She didn't mention Bigfoot. She didn't report an unidentified body. She didn't say Dale was dead. Anything that could bring more people into the gorge stayed off the radio until they were out. Slowly, the engine noise began to fade. The pounding of the rotor blades became a distant hum, then disappeared beyond the ridge. The birds didn't return right away. For several moments, the forest remained still, almost as though it too was waiting to make sure the machine had really gone. Bill slowly stepped away from where he had been standing. Owen lowered the radio. Grace relaxed her hand and only then realized her fingers had gone numb from gripping it so tightly. The male Sasquatch was still watching her. Grace stayed where she was. A minute earlier, his posture had been rigid, ready to respond to whatever came out of the sky. Now his shoulders had lowered. The branch was no longer in his hand. The smaller female removed her hand from his arm but stayed close. Grace had no idea how much a Sasquatch could understand about radios, helicopters, or human commands. Maybe the male had only noticed that the noise had approached and then disappeared. Maybe none of what Grace had done meant what she hoped it meant. But she couldn't ignore the way he looked directly at her, then toward the ridge where the helicopter had vanished, and then back at her again. He no longer looked like someone waiting to see whether the humans would take the dead away. There was something closer to recognition in his face. The humans had been given a chance to bring their entire system down into the forest. Instead, they had pushed it away. Grace knew the trust between them was still fragile enough to disappear with one bad movement. But after the last trace of rotor noise faded, something had changed. For the first time since they found the body, the Sasquatch weren't only watching them. They had judged them by the choice they had made. Grace stood beside the zigzag after the helicopter noise disappeared. The two Sasquatch remained beside the dead female, while Bill and Owen stood a few steps away from her. The next decision wasn't covered by any procedure they had ever learned, but Grace knew that if they waited too long, another team could arrive before they cleared the area. She looked at the dead female Bigfoot, then at the massive male. After more than a full day of tension, of being watched, of slowly learning how not to frighten the other side, the idea of placing that body on a stretcher and carrying her out of the forest suddenly felt so wrong that it didn't require much discussion. Grace said they weren't going to remove the dead Bigfoot. They would record the location, but the body would remain with her family. Bill nodded before she had finished speaking. Owen did the same. Nobody mentioned hair samples, the head wound, or the chance to prove what they had seen. After everything that had happened since the previous afternoon, all three understood that trying to take the body would destroy whatever fragile trust had formed. Grace no longer saw the dead female as an unclaimed piece of evidence either. The only thing left was Dale. Bill led them back toward the location he had marked, while Owen stayed near the river with the radio. Grace stopped first to check Curtis, gave him more water, examined the splint, then told him they had found Dale. Curtis closed his eyes for a long time. He didn't ask how his brother had died. They built a temporary litter from 2 straight poles, a rain tarp and rope, moved Curtis closer to the higher ground, then went back for Dale's body. Bill and Grace worked quietly. They placed Dale on the tarp and secured his arms and torso so the transport wouldn't worsen the damage to his body. Bill looked once at the broken watch, then put it away again. When they returned to the riverbank, the two Sasquatch were still there, much closer than they had been the first day. Neither showed the same defensive posture now. They simply watched the humans preparing to take Dale away, almost as if they were witnessing a ritual that mirrored their own. Grace stopped beside the dead female Bigfoot one last time. She didn't touch the body. Instead, She knelt beside her and placed one palm against the damp earth near the gray-brown hair covering the female's arm. The gesture came before any explanation. It wasn't exactly an apology, and it wasn't a promise. It was simply the only way Grace knew to say that they understood the dead belonged here and would not be carried away like evidence. The massive male stepped forward. Owen tensed but kept his hand away from his gun. Bill didn't move, his eyes following every step. The Sasquatch stopped directly above Grace, tall enough that his shadow covered her shoulders. Grace didn't look up too quickly. She kept her hand on the ground. After several seconds, the male lowered his head slightly, the same small bow he had given the dead female earlier. He made no sound. Then he stepped back. Owen later said that was the first time in his life he felt as though he had truly witnessed a funeral where not everyone attending was human. When Grace stood, nobody spoke. They lifted Dale's litter, helped Curtis into a position where he could lean on a long branch like a crutch, and began the slow withdrawal from the area. Bill moved ahead to read the terrain. Grace supported Curtis. Owen helped carry the rear of Dale's litter whenever the ground became steep. The movement was slow, heavy, and awkward, but they kept the group together. Nobody looked back when the trees gradually closed over the river behind them. Grace could still feel eyes following, but the sensation was completely different from the night before. They weren't being driven out. There were no roars, no branches thrown after them, no heavy footsteps following through the trees. Every so often, a low sound carried faintly from far behind and disappeared. Grace didn't know whether it was a farewell or simply another sound of the forest. She chose not to decide. It took them hours to get Curtis and Dale to the helicopter waiting farther west. When the medical crew came running toward them, Grace reported only one survivor with a broken leg and severe dehydration, and one fatality involving trauma from a large wild animal. Curtis was loaded first. Dale followed. Bill and Owen went up on the final trip. When the helicopter climbed over the canopy, Grace looked down but couldn't find the bend in the river again. The old forest closed beneath them as if it had never opened at all. 2 days later, Grace sat at a typewriter inside the ranger station with Bill and Owen nearby. Rick Devane wanted a full report covering the search, the time they found Curtis, Dale's condition, and the reason the helicopter had been redirected. Grace began with the truth. She typed the coordinates of the dead Bigfoot, described the body, the head wound, the 2 observing Sasquatch, Curtis's orange jacket appearing beside the body overnight, the morning calls in the dark, Curtis's account of Dale firing first, and the massive male's response. The first report ran several pages. When Grace read it back, the room was quiet enough to hear the paper sliding around the roller. Every sentence was accurate, but the longer she read, the more clearly she could picture what would happen if those pages left Devane's desk. The county sheriff would call in more people. Fish and Wildlife might close off the area. Reporters, hunters, cameras, and rifles would follow. The dead female could be removed before her family had any chance to do whatever they intended with her. Grace pulled the pages from the typewriter. She tore the report in half, then tore it again. Owen watched the pieces fall into the wastebasket and didn't object. Bill only asked what she planned to write that she could still live with afterward. Grace didn't have an answer. She loaded another sheet of paper. The second version was shorter. Grace used the phrase, "unidentified large animal," and wrote that Dale had died after an encounter in the forest while Curtis had been injured during the escape. She removed every reference to the 2 Sasquatch, the jacket placed beside the body, and the way they had stood watch over the dead. When she read that version, Bill said it protected the location, but turned everything they had witnessed into a vague wildlife accident. Owen agreed. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it didn't preserve the truth either. They sat there for nearly another hour. Finally, Bill said an administrative report existed to record what a system needed in order to process an outcome, not to contain the full meaning of an experience. Dale had died in an attack by a large wild animal after firing his rifle. Curtis had been injured while running. Those facts were true as far as the outcome was concerned, even if they left out what had led to it. Grace began the third report. The official version stated that Dale Anders died from an attack by a large wild animal, possibly a black bear. Curtis Anders was injured while retreating from the area and was later found dehydrated with a broken leg. The search and rescue team encountered difficult terrain, lost radio contact, spent the night near the search area, and redirected the helicopter because of a large animal hazard. There were no coordinates for the dead Bigfoot, no description of the morning calls, no mention of 4 eyes watching from across the river. Devane read the report, paused in several places, then asked why they hadn't recovered clear bear tracks. Bill said the ground had been badly disturbed, and most of the usable surface was wet stone. Devane asked how Curtis's rifle barrel had become bent. Grace said it happened during the confusion, and they couldn't determine the exact mechanism. He asked whether Dale had fired at the animal before he died. Grace said that according to Curtis, he had. Devane made a note and didn't pursue it much further. It was a busy hunting season. The station was short on people. Several smaller searches were happening at the same time, and the Anders case already had 1 survivor, 1 recovered body, and a witness escape that fit a fatal wildlife encounter. To Devane, it was a tragic case, but one that could be closed. There wasn't enough administrative reason to send another team into difficult backcountry simply to identify the exact species involved. Curtis was questioned again at the hospital. His leg had been surgically stabilized. The bruising across his body was changing color, and the worst of the dehydration had passed. Grace stood outside the room while an investigator asked how Dale had died. Curtis remained quiet for a long time, then said they had encountered a large animal. Dale panicked and fired, and Dale was attacked afterward. When the investigator asked whether it had been a black bear, Curtis looked once through the glass toward Grace before answering that in the confusion, he couldn't be certain what he had seen. None of the 4 signed a secrecy agreement. There was no oath, and no superior officer told them to change their story. The concealment, if that was what anyone wanted to call it, grew out of 4 people who had seen the same thing and understood what could happen if they turned it into public information. The system did the rest, almost by accident, through limited time, limited manpower, and a form that required a short cause of death. Before leaving the office on the day the report was filed, Bill stopped in the doorway, put on his hat, and looked back at Grace. He said quietly that they weren't lying. They were keeping a promise to someone who couldn't speak for themselves. Grace didn't answer, but the sentence stayed with her much longer than anything written in the report. Years later, Grace Holloway retired from search and rescue. Her knees hurt in cold weather, her hair gradually turned gray, and the trails she had once walked in darkness remained sharper in her memory than many of the faces she met afterward. Every so often, near the end of summer or beginning of fall, Grace drove back toward the zigzag alone. She didn't bring a camera, search for tracks, or try to locate the exact place where the dead female Bigfoot had once lain. She simply went close enough to hear the river and sat for a while. Bill Sorensen died a few years after the incident from old age. He never told the story to anyone outside the other 3 who had been there. At his funeral, Grace looked at the old field hat placed beside Bill's photograph and remembered him kneeling beside the river with both hands open. Owen moved to another state. He called Grace a few times each year. They talked about family, health, and people they used to know from the station. Before hanging up, Owen would usually hesitate and ask whether that area was still quiet. Grace always told him yes. Curtis recovered physically, but he never hunted again. He sold the 2 rifles he still owned, kept Dale's broken watch in a drawer, and began volunteering with forest conservation programs. His family assumed it was simply how he chose to deal with the loss of his brother. Curtis never corrected them. He picked trash from trails, repaired damaged fencing, and helped direct newcomers away from closed areas. Grace understood that he was repaying a debt nobody had ever asked him to pay. 30 years later, Grace stood near the same bend in the zigzag. The river still moved over the gravel with the same rhythm, though the trees along both banks had grown thicker. There were no tents, beer cans, or old fire rings. The country around Mount Hood had changed, but that particular stretch of forest remained almost completely empty. Grace didn't believe some supernatural force was keeping people away. The terrain was difficult, old access routes had faded, and there was little to draw casual visitors that deep. Even so, she still felt that an unspoken boundary remained. On the walk back out, Grace noticed 3 stones near the edge of the trail. They had been placed in a short row, the middle stone larger than the other 2. Nothing proved that anyone had arranged them. A hiker could have done it. Water or shifting ground could have moved them. But the pattern made Grace stop. She had seen objects placed deliberately beside the river many years earlier. Grace didn't take out her phone. She didn't touch the stones. She stood there for a moment, lowered her head slightly, then continued down the trail. At home, Grace still kept the old first aid bag she had placed on the ground in front of the 2 Sasquatch in 1987. She never used it again. The zipper had dulled, the fabric had faded, and only a few expired rolls of bandage remained inside. To Grace, it wasn't a trophy. It reminded her of the moment when a piece of rescue equipment became a gesture of trust, and of the fact that sometimes the right thing for a rescuer to do is not take something simply because they have the ability to carry it away. That day, as Grace drove away from the zigzag, she checked the rearview mirror when the road began to curve. Between the trees behind her, she saw a tall figure standing completely still, only for a second. It could have been a dark, burned trunk, overlapping shadows, or memory shaping the forest into something familiar. Grace didn't stop the car. The figure didn't come toward her and didn't threaten her. It simply remained there until the curve took it out of view. Maybe the last thing left behind by the report that was never fully written was a boundary 4 people chose to respect for the rest of their lives. What stays with me isn't the forest itself, or even what Grace saw there. It's how everything that happened could have been reduced to 3 short lines in a file. There would be no room for Grace Holloway kneeling beside someone who wasn't human, no room for Bill Sorensen standing between helicopter noise and a frightened family, and no room for Owen Petrakis witnessing a funeral he didn't have the language to name. The question isn't whether some government office covered up Bigfoot. This story is fiction, and it doesn't need a conspiracy to mean something. What matters to me is how often people take experiences too large to fit inside ordinary language and cut them down until they fit inside a form. Sometimes the part that gets left out is the part that mattered most. Grace kept that old first aid bag in her closet, not as evidence and not as a trophy. To her, it was only a reminder that sometimes respecting something you don't fully understand matters more than bringing it home to prove it existed. If this story makes you believe there are still things deep in the woods that people don't fully understand, comment "Believe" below. And if you want to keep hearing Bigfoot stories like this one, subscribe to Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. I'm Victor, and I'll see you in the next story.